بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Him to send His peace and blessings upon our teacher and our master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is our example, our perfect and beautiful example in how to live the Quran in our lives today. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us benefit from any knowledge that we have gained, and to continue to increase us in knowledge that is beneficial for ourselves and for our community. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. So in the time we have today, as you were told, I'm going to give a shorter presentation, and then Sister Henna will be also presenting, and then we'll have it an open discussion, question and answer. And this is really important because, you know, one of the limitations very often in our community is that we often only have one voice speaking, and because of that, we do not hear all of the concerns of our community, and we don't necessarily benefit from all of the wisdom of our community. And so, of course, during the Friday khutbah, we all have to sit quietly. There's one speaker and the rest of us are listeners. But in other settings in our community, we really need to come together and benefit from our wisdom, our experiences, and our perspectives. And that's what we will try to model today as well. So we are gathered here today at the request of many of the Celebrate Mercy community because of your concern about the news that we have heard of a really very terrible case of abuse of a child by someone who has been teaching the Quran. And we're not here to adjudicate or discuss that case in particular. That is with law enforcement and the courts. And that's where it belongs, because we do not have the ability to do this kind of investigation and yes, and take that further. But we do have an ability as a community to learn more about how we may better protect our community from harm. Doesn't mean every case is going to be stopped, but we can learn about how to make our community spaces safer, better, more wholesome, more uplifting for every person who enters into them. And inshallah, we can also learn how we should respond as individuals, as family members, as friends, as community members, and as leaders in the community when we learn about incident of abuse that has happened within our spaces. I know that many of you are coming to join us here today as parents, and that is of course, a role which is yours specifically and uniquely with your child, but we all have a responsibility in the community to protect all children. That is a communal obligation, and it is also the reality that many of us have positions in the Muslim community where we ourselves are teachers, chaplains, scholars, preachers, maybe volunteering in the community to give a lesson or a lecture. Also, our board members, the members of the boards of our masajid and our schools, they come from the community. And this is why we need a broad understanding of some of the dynamics that we're speaking about today. So in particular, today we're talking about children and spiritual and sexual abuse. And I'll tell you that the way that I first became aware of the particular kind of problems that we might see in the Muslim community was not by hearing directly from children or knowing directly from children about what had happened to them, but hearing from adults who came to me, male adults, female adults, Muslim men and Muslim women in the community, who came to me because maybe I was their teacher or I was in a position of leadership in a Muslim institution, or I was just someone in the community who they thought they could approach to discuss about this. And these adults told me that they were having, for example, um, uh, dysfunction in their marriage. They were having trouble engaging with intimacy in their marriage. Also, others who came to me and said that they had become alienated from their religion, even though they had been raised as a Muslim, sent to Islamic schools, some of them even Quranic schools. And the reason all of these people shared this with me, that their problems began when they were abused as children in a Muslim community space. And to see the terrible impact that this abuse had on these believers while they were adults. Some of them were in their 30s, 40s, and they were still suffering from the impact of having been abused as a child. And there's a lot of reasons why they may still have been suffering, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were abused, and then the reaction was to not be believed, was to not be supported. They were shamed when they shared their experience. They were told they were liars, or they themselves, by their abuser made them feel ashamed. Their abuser, who was older, who had authority, who had power, they were confused. They didn't know how to talk about it. And to see the ramifications, the consequences of this abuse continuing into adulthood was very, very sad indeed. And like many of you, probably, at first I thought, well, we just have to find out who these people are and report them to the boards or whoever is in charge. But then what I found is that when I went to the heads of schools and institutions, or masajid or madaris, where these things had occurred, there was a lot of denial. There was a lot of, even if they recognized that it happened, they were more worried about protecting their reputation, the reputation of the institution, than about addressing the harm. And this was very disturbing to me, and it made me realize that we needed to have a deeper study of this. And this is why about 5-6 years ago, I and some of my colleagues began studying this phenomenon of spiritual abuse in the Muslim community, and trying to learn what our responsibilities are, how we can address this, what we can do to prevent some of it, most of it maybe, and what we should do when we found out how to respond to it. Now, when we talk about spiritual abuse, we mean that the abuse is enabled or made possible or justified in many ways because the abuser is in a position of religious authority or trust. So we say, well, this is someone who is a scholar of the Quran, or an imam, or a teacher. They are in a position of trust, so people think, well, if we can't trust them, who can we trust? Or the abuse has happened in a place that is considered to be safe. So, for example, an Islamic school or a masjid, people think, well, the space itself must be safe because this is a Muslim space. So what happens is that the ordinary Muslim, we have trust for our institutions, for those who are put in positions of authority or teaching. And then what happens is these things happen, and the person who's been abused then very often will become alienated from those teachings, from that person, from those institutions, from the Muslim community, even, subhanAllah, very tragically, sometimes from the Quran or Islam itself. And this is why spiritual abuse is particularly harmful and problematic, and why when people use their religious authority, status, or knowledge, or even teachings, for example, to say that when, for example, they know that abuse has happened, but rather than addressing it and stopping that person, they cover up for them. And so they misuse a religious teaching like sitr. Sitr means veiling or covering the sins of our Muslim brother or sister. This is an authentic teaching. It is an authentic Islamic tradition, but it does not apply in cases of abuse. Sitr applies in cases where someone has committed a sin that is impacting their own soul, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sitr does not apply when someone is abusing another believer, because in that case, the person who has been abused, who has suffered dhulm or oppression or harm, has a right for intervention, for justice to happen. And the Prophet Muhammad said, help your believer, whether he is an oppressor or is being oppressed. And when the companions wondered, how do we help our brother who's an oppressor? The Prophet Muhammad said, by stopping him from committing his oppression. That is helping him, because otherwise he continues, the abuser even continues to accumulate sins that they'll be accountable in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for on the day of judgment. Now, what I want to emphasize here today are a few things. The first thing is that when we think about whose obligation it is to protect children from spiritual and sexual abuse, Sister Hannah will be offering tips for parents about their relationship with children and educating children to provide the protection that's possible from that perspective and that relationship. And this is very important. And we've asked her to come here today because the reality is this is not my area of expertise. So when I faced all of these different situations and heard these terrible stories from people who had been abused by a religious teacher or in a religious circumstance, or had been abused and then had been told, just be quiet because we need to protect Islam or the reputation of the community. So all of these things happen. You know, there are certain things I could understand from the Islamic perspective about justice, about right and wrong, about the concept of hurma, which is what we named our project. Hurma meaning the sacred inviolability of the human person. That means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made every believer, every person have a certain sanctity that should not be violated. Inviolability means to not violate. So no one should violate that sanctity of the person in their body, in their body, in their possessions, in their honor, because there can be all sorts of forms of abuse, financial, physical, emotional, sexual, all sorts of things that forms of abuse that can be justified or enabled by the misuse of religious teachings or authority. So there were some things that I, in my expertise as a religious scholar, could understand and knew and could teach about, but there were other things that I did not know. So I have, like every other, human being and Muslim, basic idea of what we do in our community and my own intuitions about relating with children, but not all of my intuitions are necessarily correct. And that's why we need to engage with experts in these areas. And this is what we've done for 6 years now. And the thing that I want to tell you and emphasize today is that those other than the person who is choosing to abuse or not to abuse someone, they of course have the greatest responsibility. But apart from them, it is the Muslim institutions and organizations that have the fundamental responsibility of making sure that the people that they put up as teachers or on the minbar or as imams or as scholars or sheikhs or chaplains or youth camp leaders or whatever it is the Muslim organizations and institutions that have the primary responsibility for putting in place checks and balances to make sure that they have deeply, deeply vetted the people they're going to put in a position of influence. And after they do that, they continue to exercise reasonable supervision, rational supervision, that they have a complaint system that is accessible and open to everyone in the community in case there is a question of abuse or misuse of position. So all of these things are necessary. And it's not only, it's not only that there's a code of conduct, but how is that code of conduct enforced? It's not only that there are board policies, but are those board policies being implemented? It's not only that that someone should have the initial religious education, but if they find out if they are going to have any contact with people, and our Muslims will come to religious scholars for advice, whether those scholars are qualified or not, those scholars need to be trained in learning how to set boundaries, boundaries about their own knowledge, boundaries about where they meet with people, when they meet with people, how to make referrals. And all of this information and knowledge is available. We have educational programs where we can train people in these techniques. There are organizations offering programs in governance and oversight, operations in and human resource management in our institutions. All of this sounds very boring, and frankly, when you sit in some of these meetings, in the board meetings or the committee meetings in the institutions, yes, it's not the thing that's going to give you the high, spiritual level that you're seeking of engaging with a religious institution, but it's necessary. Being an adult means taking the necessary steps to do what is right. Being a self-governing Muslim community, which we are, we claim we have a right to establish these institutions. We definitely say that to the government and to all other governing authorities. And if we are going to claim this right, then we also have to take responsibility to govern ourselves and operate in a very in a way that is safe, that is proven, and not just one time, but we continue to return to our processes and procedures and improve them. And as new knowledge becomes available, then we also integrate that into our learning. For example, I think I have a few minutes left here before we'll turn it over to Sister Henna. So when people first came to me and disclosed that they, as children, had been abused, the settings were things like a hafiz coming to their house and tutoring them in the Quran and in reading the Quran as a child. Their mother may have been in the kitchen. The door was open, but nevertheless, some abuse could happen under the table, on the side, different areas like that. I don't want to get into graphic details about these things. And let me just say that if there's anyone here that listening to this has experienced abuse themselves, or is remembering that they have experienced abuse, maybe you disclosed it when you were a child, but you were disbelieved, and now you're remembering it again. Just to take the time, I know it can be overwhelming, take the time, take a breath, relax. We will have, inshallah, a way for you to be able to connect with Henna either during, I'm not sure if the technology is allowing for it during the program, but we'll make at least a contact available after the program so that you can discuss your situation and she can help you find the support you need. So to know that there are a lot of people who are available to help you, you're not alone, and there are people who will believe you. But when I first heard about this, I heard about abuse happening in the home. I heard about it happening at youth camps. It could be a volunteer at a youth camp, even an older camper, or one of the adult teachers. It could have been, it's not just about males abusing females. There are males who have abused males. Even I've heard of cases of a female abusing a male minor. And so the issue isn't the gender, but the issue is, is there someone who's in position of authority and influence over another person, even between adults? Today we're talking about children, but of course the same thing can happen with adults. If you have someone who everyone turns to for religious knowledge and authority, who's trusted, then an adult also can be vulnerable, because if that person tells them, no, this is right, or you should do this, they're already trusting their religion, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with them. Why would they not trust them with some of these matters of the dunya? But we understand how that can happen, but that is where we need to change our way of thinking. We, the ordinary Muslims, that when we are engaging with scholars, we understand that being a scholar does not mean that scholar is perfect, that what they may be teaching, what they're teaching may be perfect. If it's the Quran, it is perfect. It's Allah's word, but they are still a human being. We should also know the very sad reality is, and we see it across society, is that if there's someone who is a predatory person or an abuser or who has this sickness in them, that those people, predators, look for the weak areas, the places where security is weak, the places where someone who's vulnerable is not well protected. Think, for example, if it's the middle of the night and there's a burglar walking down the street. Now, is that burglar which house will he go into? He might go in, he's going to choose the house with the open window rather than the one with obvious alarms on it, right? So we have to be able to deter those people, but they're very sneaky and they look for those weak spots. And so it's not that this is necessarily someone who was just a normal person studying the Quran and suddenly went bad. It could be that this is a person who was looking for opportunities to exploit others and found them because our community protections were not sufficient. We had not undertaken the responsibility of truly not only vetting them, but also helping our community understand what is and what is not reasonable in terms of relating with or communicating with these people. So, for example, in the past, every situation I heard about was an in-person situation. It was in a mosque or a home or a school or a camp or a conference or a convention or a learning retreat. But now we have all of this technology. And especially since COVID, so much of our learning is online. And our children even went to school for a few years virtually, for many of us. They've become very comfortable with cameras, with connecting with people online. We put them on the phone to their relatives in another country to video chat. And so now this technology creates another kind of risk. Now, Inshallah, Hina will give some recommendations for parents about this. But what I want to say is, again, there's a huge responsibility on our Muslim communities. So, for example, if I don't, but say, for example, I had my own learning platform and there were 4 or 5 scholars who taught on this learning platform, I should make it very clear in writing, and this should be emphasized to all of the students on the platform, that they should only be contacted via this platform or other designated means by any teacher who teaches. And if they were contacted by one of our teachers in a different way, by some chat or chat, WhatsApp or Signal or a Telegram or something like this, or if they're contacted out of hours, the hours of teaching or student advising hours, that they should actually report that teacher to the administration. Now, it seems, I don't think that's something that any of us have done up to now, but we're realizing this is the new risk and the emerging risk. So again, rather than just saying to parents, monitor your kids' video activity, it's a responsibility of all of us who create platforms for teaching and learning to let everyone who accesses those platforms understand what are the boundaries and limits for appropriate communication between students and community members with any of the teachers on the platform. So inshallah, this gives us an idea of where the responsibility lies and how we need to move forward, inshallah. So I'm looking at my my timeline here, schedule, and is it time for me to pass it over yet, Brother Bilal?
You are good on time. We're going to go a little longer today, everyone, because this is such a critical conversation. We don't want to gloss over anything. So, okay. Dr. Mattson, you're right, on track, inshallah. Before I welcome, is this where you want to pause to welcome?
I'm just going to just give one example of something that I've learned before I pass it over, just to share with people why, again, I've seen, for example, in this circumstance, that there's a lot of interest in people wanting to learn what to do. And I'm really glad about that, because sometimes in the past, there was a lot of denial in our community. But I see that people want to learn. I also see that too often, in a very sincere desire to condemn what is wrong, some people are giving recommendations or giving tips for parents and community members that actually are not helpful, that are counterproductive. So we need to, again, rather than always looking to the religious scholars for all of the answers, we have to look to the people who have knowledge of a particular subject to give the answers. And I'm just going to give you an example from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and then an example from my own learning related to this topic. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of a very often discussed hadith about when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was passing by people who were working in a date palm orchard. So this is in Medina, and the Prophet Muhammad asked what the people were doing, and they replied that, well, they are pollinating or grafting the tree, and it's a kind of technique where you take some branches that have the female or the male onto the female parts of the tree, and this way they'll become pollinated. Now, and the Prophet Muhammad said, oh, I don't think that's going to be of any use. And then he left, and when people heard that, they stopped doing it. And then the Prophet Muhammad when he came by later, and he saw that the yield of the orchard was less than it had been before, he asked, what happened to these trees, because they were doing well. And they said, well, we implemented your order about not using this technique for increasing the yield of the fruit. And the Prophet Muhammad said, that was just my opinion. Don't follow my personal opinion, but when I tell you anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then accept it. Because anything I say about Allah is true, but if it's something of my personal opinion, take it or leave it, because you understand you have knowledge of what you're doing better than I do. And so this understanding that, subhanAllah, the Prophet Muhammad was from the Arabian Peninsula, but he grew up in Mecca rather than Medina. So he didn't grow up in an agricultural oasis, but he moved there. And certainly anyone in the Arabian Peninsula had kind of general knowledge of of dates and date palms. I mean, this is a staple of their life. But the details of pollination and fertilization and bearing fruit, he didn't have, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so this gives a good lesson for us that if we're talking about children, how to teach children about their bodies, what kind of education about their bodies and sexuality is appropriate and relevant, that we really should turn to those people who have expert knowledge in this, who have studied this, who have heard from survivors, people who have suffered abuse, people who over the years have really dug deep into this topic. And one of the things, and I'll tell you how I've implemented this in my life, something that I learned. I remember hearing probably about 10 years ago, someone saying, when there's a child, you shouldn't just hug a child or go up to a child and say, give me a kiss or hug me, or the parent shouldn't push that child to another adult and say, what's wrong with you? Give your auntie or uncle a hug or a kiss, because this teaches children that they don't have a right to control their body, who touches their body, or how they feel. And I remember when I first heard it, I thought, yeah, it seems a little strange because a lot of Muslim cultures are very warm. We greet by hugging or shaking hands, and this is a big part of the culture. But I started to implement it in my life, and at first it became awkward. But then over time, I began to implement it, and it felt very good and comfortable. And I liked to see the children having that kind of agency. So even with the young people in my own family, at first, if their parents sort of pushed them to me, or someone in the Muslim community pushed their child to me, I said, no, it's okay. They can, don't make them hug me or kiss me. They can, if they want to, they may, but let's let them approach me rather than force this. And you see the confidence begin to build in the child. It doesn't make our community any less warm. It just makes children safer. And so that's something I didn't understand intuitively, but upon hearing from experts and starting to implement in my life, I learned. And we all have to continue learning, all of us continue learning, because we live in a very complex world.